Retailers are warning of empty shelves reminiscent of the pandemic, with the 145% tariff on nearly all Chinese imports in place.
Imagine a world where one group of people becomes millionaires, another escapes poverty for the first time, and a third watches their wages flatline for 20 years, despite working just as hard. This isn't science fiction. It's what actually happened between 1988 and 2008, during one of the most aggressive periods of globalization in history. You've probably heard that globalization makes everyone better off. But what if that's only part of the story? In this video, we're going beyond the headlines and looking at who really won and who lost as the global economy exploded. We'll explore how trade transformed China, hollowed out Western factories, boosted billionaires, and helped shape the world we live in today. What role did trade deals, tariffs, and outsourcing really play? Why are some communities thriving while others are barely holding on? And how does all this connect to politics, rising tensions with China, and the economic choices we're facing right now? Once you see the full picture, you might start questioning everything you've heard about free trade and economic growth. While millions in Asia were rising, there was a different story playing out in other parts of the world. One group in particular was largely left behind: the lower middle class in Western countries, including the United States. Over the same period, their incomes barely moved. In real terms, once you adjust for inflation, many people saw no significant improvement in their living standards at all. Then there's the top 1%, the world's wealthiest individuals. Their incomes didn't just rise, they soared. In fact, the income gains of the global elite during this time were almost as dramatic as those of the new middle class in Asia. While the two groups sit at opposite ends of the global economy, they both benefited greatly from how trade, technology, and finance evolved during this era. So what exactly is going on here? If globalization was supposed to lift all boats, why did it leave so many behind? The truth is, this chart helps explain a lot, not just about economics, but also about politics and public opinion. It tells us something important about the pressures that have been building beneath the surface for decades, especially in Western democracies. It might even help explain why we've seen the rise of populist leaders, shifts in political alliances, and growing skepticism around trade deals and international institutions. One example of this shift is the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and again in 2024. His message about putting America first and bringing back jobs found strong support among working-class voters, particularly in areas hit hard by the decline of manufacturing. Many of these voters felt left behind by the global economy and were looking for someone who promised to shake things up. But the story goes deeper than just one politician. What we're really seeing is the impact of long-term economic trends that began decades ago. Globalization, in theory, benefits everyone. Economists have long argued that when countries specialize in producing what they're best at and trade with others, it leads to more efficient production and lower prices. That's the basis of the theory of comparative advantage, which has been taught in universities for over a century. And in practice, global trade has led to impressive outcomes: more goods, faster innovation, and cheaper products for consumers. But theory doesn't always match reality in a neat and tidy way. In the real world, trade doesn't affect all people equally. Some industries grow, others shrink. Some workers find better opportunities, while others lose their jobs. The gains from globalization are real, but they're not evenly spread. And this is where the problem lies. Take manufacturing, for example. In the US, it used to be a major source of stable, middle-class jobs, especially in places like the Midwest. These weren't just jobs. They were careers that offered decent pay, benefits, and a sense of identity. But as more factories moved overseas, many of those jobs disappeared. Whole communities were affected, and the economic ripple effects are still being felt today. Meanwhile, the people and companies at the top, those who own capital, who design products, manage supply chains, or invest globally, were in a much better position to benefit from the new economic order. If you're running a multinational business and can cut production costs by shifting manufacturing to a lower-cost country, that's a win. If you're a shareholder in that business, it's a win for you too. But if you're the factory worker who lost their job as a result, it's a very different story. This growing gap between winners and losers is one reason why income inequality has become such a big issue. not just in the United States, but across much of the Western world. It's also why GDP alone doesn't tell the full story. Economies can grow overall, while large parts of the population see little to no improvement in their quality of life. And this isn't just about economics, it's also about trust. When people feel like the system is no longer working for them, they start to question the institutions and ideas that underpin it. That includes things like free trade agreements, international organizations, and even democratic norms. In the early years of globalization, the benefits seemed obvious. Products became cheaper, travel got easier, and new technologies spread quickly across borders. But over time, the downsides became more visible, especially in places that lost industries, jobs, and a sense of economic security. This shift in public sentiment didn't happen overnight. It built up slowly over years as people saw their communities change and their prospects narrow. And by the time politicians started talking seriously about bringing jobs back or rethinking trade policy, many people already felt that the damage had been done. Of course, it's important not to paint this as a completely one-sided story. Globalization has helped lift more people out of poverty than any other force in modern history. Countries like China, India, and Vietnam have made enormous progress, and that matters. It's also true that trade has brought lower prices for consumers in developed countries, allowing many families to afford things that might otherwise have been out of reach. But recognizing the global benefits doesn't mean ignoring the local costs. And the problem isn't necessarily globalization itself. It's how the gains from it have been shared. When trade policies are designed in a way that prioritizes efficiency over fairness, the result is often growing inequality. That's why so many economists and policymakers are now talking about the need for inclusive growth, or fair trade, instead of just free trade. The roots of the global economy we know today go back to a time just after World War II. In 1947, 23 countries, including the United States, came together in Geneva to sign a document known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT for short. It was a key moment. These countries agreed to reduce tariffs, the taxes placed on imported goods, which had long been used to protect domestic industries but also limited international commerce. The idea was to make trade more open, more predictable, and ultimately more beneficial for everyone involved. At that time, the United States was in a unique position. Much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, trying to rebuild after years of war. In contrast, the US had emerged from the conflict with its economy not only intact, but thriving. In fact, by the late 1940s, the United States accounted for over half of global GDP. It had an unmatched level of economic influence and also possessed the world's most powerful navy, allowing it to guarantee the security of global shipping routes. This gave the US the power and the motivation to lead the charge toward freer trade. There were two major reasons behind this push. One was geopolitical. By opening up trade with other nations, the United States could build alliances and spread its influence without relying solely on military force. In the context of the early Cold War, economic cooperation was a tool for shaping the world in America's image. The other reason was more academic. According to the theory of comparative advantage, free trade allows each country to specialize in what it does best, leading to greater efficiency and higher overall output. In short, trade would make everyone richer. This wasn't just a theory being pushed by economists. It became the foundation for decades of policy. Over time, countries slowly lowered tariffs and dismantled other trade barriers. If you look at the data, you can see this change clearly. In the 1800s, the United States was charging an average tariff of up to 57% on imported goods. By 1947, that number had dropped to around 7.9%. Fast forward to 1995, and it had fallen to just 2.5%. That year, 1995, marked another major milestone. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, was officially created. Headquartered in Geneva, it replaced GATT as the main international body responsible for overseeing trade rules and settling disputes between member countries. Today, the WTO has 166 member nations, accounting for 98% of global GDP and covering 93% of the world's population. Its main goal is still the same: to promote smoother and more predictable trade between countries by reducing tariffs and addressing other types of restrictions. Following the creation of the WTO, tariffs continued to decline. By the 2010s, the average U.S. tariff on imports was less than 1.5%. This helped global trade to flourish. From 1950 to 2023, the volume of goods traded across borders increased by around 4,400%. And as trade expanded, so did the size of the global economy. Worldwide GDP jumped from $12 trillion in 1950 to more than $167 trillion by 2021. On paper, this looks like an incredible achievement. More trade, more goods, more wealth. But the numbers don't always tell the whole story. To get a clearer picture, we need to look at what happened to the United States trade balance. The trade balance is essentially the difference between what a country exports and what it imports. A positive trade balance means you're selling more than you're buying. A negative one means the opposite. In the US, the trade balance has been negative for decades, and it's been getting worse. In 2024, the country ran a goods trade deficit of $1.22 trillion. That's the gap between what Americans buy from the rest of the world and what the rest of the world buys from the US. This trade deficit started becoming noticeable in the 1970s and 1980s. Back then, Japan was the main concern. It had become a manufacturing powerhouse, exporting large quantities of cars, electronics, and other goods to the US. The imbalance grew to the point where Japan was seen by some as an economic threat. Among those critics was Donald Trump, a New York businessman at the time, who in a 1998 interview complained that the US was allowing Japan to flood American markets while making it nearly impossible for American companies to sell their goods in Japan. According to him, this wasn't real free trade, but rather an uneven playing field. What he was pointing out were issues related to non-tariff barriers. These include things like regulations, licensing requirements, and other technical rules that can make it hard for foreign companies to enter a market. Japan, for example, had various practices that limited competition from outside, and these technical barriers were often more difficult to deal with than straightforward tariffs. By 2025, Japan is no longer seen as the main challenge. That title now belongs to China. In the 1990s, China began to open up its economy through internal reforms. It had a vast pool of low-cost labor, which made it extremely attractive for manufacturing. As a result, many companies moved their production to China, kicking off a massive export boom. Much of that output ended up in the United States, creating a growing trade imbalance between the two nations. In 2028, the U.S. trade deficit with China reached a record $419 billion, about 2% of the total American economy. China wasn't the only contributor to this imbalance. Countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Germany, Japan, and Canada also added to the deficit. But in many cases, these countries were acting as intermediaries for Chinese goods. Chinese manufacturers would ship their products to places like Mexico or Vietnam, where minor changes were made before they were exported to the U.S. This allowed companies to sidestep tariffs, making the actual trade imbalance with China even larger than official figures suggest. The big concern behind these numbers isn't just about trade, it's about jobs. As production moved overseas, especially to China, the U.S. lost many of its manufacturing jobs. While these jobs were once central to the American middle class, they started to vanish. And even though unemployment eventually recovered, many of the new jobs that replaced them didn't offer the same pay, security, or benefits. At the heart of the issue is the claim that what's happening with China isn't true free trade. When China joined the WTO in 2001, it promised to open its markets, reduce tariffs, and follow the rules. But over the years, critics argue that China has not held up its end of the bargain. In the 2000s, it still maintained an average tariff rate of about 5%, and in the 2010s, the rate remained between 3 and 5%. At the same time, the US was charging less than 1.5%. This gave Chinese companies a significant advantage. It also hasn't been easy for American businesses trying to operate in China. Excessive regulation, favoritism towards local firms, and mandatory joint ventures have made things difficult. In some industries, foreign companies are required to partner with a Chinese firm, often giving up control and sharing valuable intellectual property in the process. This has led to another major complaint: intellectual property theft. According to U.S. government estimates, the theft of American trade secrets and IP by Chinese entities costs the U.S. economy around $600 billion every year. Over time, this adds up to trillions in lost value. And while exact figures are hard to pin down, the impact on innovation and business competitiveness is widely acknowledged. Beyond these issues, there's also the question of how China's state-controlled economic model interacts with the global trading system. According to a 2024 report by the United States Trade Representative, China continues to operate in a way that goes against WTO principles. State-owned enterprises still play a massive role in the Chinese economy, accounting for around 40% of its GDP. Many so-called private companies also have Communist Party committees embedded in their leadership, raising questions about independence and fair competition. This becomes especially concerning when China uses its state-backed resources to flood global markets with specific products. Steel is a prime example. With support from state banks and favorable tax policies, Chinese companies were able to overproduce steel and sell it abroad at very low prices, a process known as dumping. This has led to the closure of many steel plants in Western countries, especially in the US and Europe. The same pattern has been seen in industries like solar panels, electric vehicles, and now, increasingly, artificial intelligence and semiconductors. All of this has raised questions about whether the current system of global trade is truly fair, and whether the institutions meant to enforce the rules are doing enough. It's not just an economic issue, it's a strategic one as well. When domestic industries are undercut by foreign state-backed competition, the long-term consequences go beyond lost jobs. It can affect national security, technological leadership, and economic resilience. The effects of globalization and trade imbalances are not just economic statistics, they're deeply personal. To understand the human impact, it's important to look again at the chart we started with, the one showing income growth between 1988 and 2008. The global middle class, especially in Asia, made huge gains during those years. The global top 1% also saw their incomes rise significantly. But one group, lower middle income earners in Western countries, particularly in the United States, fell behind. Their income growth was close to zero over a 20-year span. For many, this is more than just a temporary dip. It reflects a long-term stagnation that has reshaped communities, altered the political landscape, and triggered a wave of frustration that still hasn't settled. This is especially visible in areas that once relied on manufacturing. These were towns and cities where factory jobs formed the backbone of the local economy. When those factories closed or moved overseas, entire regions lost not just jobs but a sense of purpose and financial stability. Between 2001 and 2018, the United States lost an estimated 3.7 million jobs due to its trade deficit with China, according to research by the Economic Policy Institute. That figure alone is comparable to the population of a city like Los Angeles. And while it's true that not all jobs lost to trade are gone forever, many have been replaced in other sectors. These new jobs often come with lower wages, fewer benefits, and less job security. Today, unemployment in the United States is relatively low by historical standards. On paper, that sounds like good news. But the nature of work has changed. Many of the new jobs are in services, gig work, or low-paid industries that don't offer the same upward mobility or economic security that manufacturing once did. This has led to a more subtle but damaging problem: wage stagnation. When we look at the bottom 90% of income earners in the U.S., real wage growth, after adjusting for inflation, has been less than 0.5% per year. For those in the bottom 50%, the situation is even worse. Meanwhile, the top 1% has experienced real wage growth nearly 10 times higher. This gap isn't just about inequality. It's also about who benefits from globalization and who doesn't. One of the reasons behind this divide is the way global supply chains operate. When manufacturing is outsourced to countries with lower labor costs, companies can dramatically reduce expenses. This benefits executives, investors, and skilled professionals who are involved in design, logistics, or finance. But it doesn't help workers in domestic manufacturing who lose their jobs or see their wages suppressed due to competition. For example, a CEO at a multinational company might get a bonus if they successfully relocate a factory overseas and cut costs. Engineers and supply chain managers in tech firms benefit too, as they can scale up production more cheaply by using overseas facilities. But the line workers, machine operators, and quality control staff in the original American factory, many of them are out of work or forced to accept lower-paying jobs. This creates a sharp contrast. High-skilled, high-income workers thrive, while low-skilled, middle-income workers fall behind. The result is growing frustration with the direction of the economy and, in many cases, with the political system itself. People feel like they're working just as hard but not getting ahead. For some, it even feels like the system is rigged against them. And this feeling isn't imaginary. Economically, GDP in both the United States and China has grown dramatically over the last 2 decades. From a macro perspective, that seems like a success. But GDP is an average. It doesn't show how the benefits are distributed. If one person earns an extra $1 million while 99 others earn the same as before, GDP goes up, but most people aren't any better off. This economic backdrop played a big role in Donald Trump's election victories, particularly in swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. These states were once manufacturing powerhouses. When Trump promised to bring jobs back and take a tougher stance on China, it resonated with people who had felt ignored by both major parties for years. Now, as president, Trump has returned to using tariffs as a tool to protect American industries. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods. By making foreign products more expensive, they're supposed to give domestic producers a competitive edge. In theory, this helps to protect jobs in sectors like steel, cars, and electronics, where competition from low-wage countries has been intense. Tariffs also serve as a source of government revenue. That revenue can, in theory, be used to fund tax cuts or other public services. This approach, known as protectionism, has been used by many countries throughout history. The idea is to protect domestic industries, especially during periods of economic development or when facing unfair competition. Historically, protectionism has had mixed results. In the early days of the United States, tariffs helped develop local industries. Germany followed a similar path in the 19th century. More recently, countries like Japan, South Korea, and China used protectionist policies to build up their own manufacturing capacity before competing on the global stage. In those cases, the strategy worked well, partly because those countries were still developing and needed time to grow their industries. But protectionism doesn't always work. Countries like Brazil, India, and especially Argentina have used tariffs in ways that ended up doing more harm than good. In Argentina's case, protectionist policies under leaders like Juan Perón ended up stifling innovation, reducing competitiveness, and worsening inflation. The key problem with protectionism is that it can remove the incentive for domestic companies to improve. If they're protected from competition, they may not innovate or reduce costs, which can lead to lower productivity in the long run. There's also a risk that other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, sparking a trade war. This can reduce overall trade, hurt exporters, and increase prices for consumers. So while protectionism might help certain industries in the short term, the long-term effects are often more complex. That said, the alternative, continuing with the current trade system, has its own risks. If nothing changes, the trend of the lower middle class falling behind is likely to continue. This raises deeper questions about the sustainability of economic growth that doesn't benefit everyone. Another concern with the growing trade deficit is that it leads to foreign ownership of U.S. assets. When the United States imports more than it exports, foreign countries accumulate U.S. dollars. They often reinvest those dollars into the American economy, buying government bonds, corporate debt, stocks, farmland, and real estate. On the surface, this might seem like a good thing. It means that foreign investors have confidence in the U.S. economy. But it can also create vulnerabilities. Today, about 24% of U.S. government debt is held by foreign entities, including China. Around 30% of corporate debt is foreign-owned. In the stock market, foreign ownership sits at roughly 20%. Over the past 15 years, foreign buyers have also purchased $1.2 trillion worth of U.S. residential property. Chinese investors alone have bought around 10% of the properties sold to foreign buyers. and over 40 million acres of U.S. farmland is now owned by foreign nationals, an area roughly the size of the state of Washington. There's a balance to be struck here. On one hand, foreign investment can help fuel economic growth and lower interest rates. On the other hand, if too much of the country's assets are controlled by foreign governments or companies, it could create strategic risks. For example, if diplomatic relations sour, or if foreign investors decide to pull out suddenly, the effects on the economy could be serious. This situation also creates an unusual dynamic. America is buying goods from China, and in return, China is buying up parts of America: land, debt, and businesses. This raises concerns about sovereignty, economic independence, and national security, especially in a time of growing geopolitical tension between the two countries. So what's the solution? That's the difficult part. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. The challenges are both economic and political, domestic and international. It's about trade, but it's also about education, infrastructure, innovation, and investment. It's about creating a system that rewards work, encourages competition, and supports those left behind by rapid change. The goal isn't to undo globalization, but to manage it better, to ensure that the benefits are more broadly shared, and to build an economy that works for everyone, not just the few at the top or the lucky ones in rising economies abroad. Whether through trade reform, smarter regulation, or targeted investment in domestic industries and education, there are tools that can help. But to use them effectively, we have to start by understanding how we got here and who the current system is really working for.